Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. Today I'm going to be riffing about the differences between trends and insights and why this distinction is important when you're considering what your data is telling you. So you might hear the words trends and insights thrown around in the same sentences or phrases in your workplace. And you couldn't be blamed for thinking that perhaps those two words are interchangeable and largely mean the same thing. This episode is going to unpack the differences between the two because they are actually really two different things. Both are incredibly valid and useful, and we do need to be looking for both things, but they're actually quite different and quite unique. So we'll start off with a trend. And if we think about a trend, it's actually something that we know to be a pattern in the data. It's largely something that we expect, and it's when a metric or a set of data or an outcome mirrors what we were expecting to happen. So if we were expecting something to remain quite consistent or similar to what happened in the last quarter or last month, that would be a trend. If we know that over the last 6 months, our turnover had been increasing at a pretty steady rate and it continued to increase this month, then that would be a pattern as well. Oftentimes, a trend is something that we can see over a longer period of time. So it's when we look at data longitudinally and we can start to see in a time series analysis or over particular time intervals, we can see a particular trend happening. So we can see, for example, the value of shares over time. There's a trend upwards, downwards. Perhaps they're performing in a really similar way to what they have over the last couple of months, but we can see over a longer period of time what's been happening. We know that the trend, well, in Australia anyway, that the trend over 123-ish years of the Australian stock market, we know the trend is that there has been an average annual growth of about 13% since 1900, which is pretty awesome if you are investing in shares. But we obviously know that year on year and month by month and week by week and day by day, there are variations and fluctuations. But if we zoom out and we look at that overall trend, we can see that generally there is improvement after falls and crashes. And as I say, there has been a general trend. If you go and look at a graph showing the value of the Australian Stock Exchange from the beginning, you can see almost a beautifully linear increase and growth over time. I was doing some work with a banker recently, and she has a team, and she was asking me to look at some of the data for the people that she leads, and she was looking at things like the number of deals completed, the success rate with putting in deals to be processed, and the time that it takes each staff member to deliver on some of those deals. Now, when you're thinking about trends for her, if we know that particular staff members or teams month in, month out are continuing to complete roughly about the same amount of deals each month, they have a very similar success rate, that's a pattern, that's something that we've come to expect. Equally though, if we can see over time that collectively this team is actually starting to improve and their deal completion rate is actually improving, we might know that we can roughly start to expect there's about a 5% improvement roughly each month, and it's on an upwards trajectory, then that would also be a trend. So it's something that we've come to expect, and we're not surprised when we look into the data and get the new information about our team. It just reaffirms what we were expecting or what we were hoping to happen. On the flip side, an insight is something that shifts our perspective. So I really love Gary Klein's work on this. He wrote a book called Seeing What Others Don't. And he talks about that idea of it's actually moving from the pattern recognition, which is a trend, into what are those aha moments for us. So an insight is something that really piques our interest, it sparks our curiosity, it's a bit of a light bulb moment, it's something that shakes us or makes us think that actually I'm really surprised by this is not what I expected. One of the examples that he uses in his book is the idea of fantasy football. And he says when people are given the same data for players and they make choices about who they include in their fantasy football team, people make different decisions because they interpret different information in different ways and they emphasize the importance of different elements. And so ultimately we have people who win fantasy football, or whether it's tipping competitions or whatever it might be, and we have people who fail miserably and end up at the bottom. That's usually me. And what this story highlights for me is that insights are deeply personal. If I was to give every person who listened to this episode the same type of data and asked you what the main insight was for that data set, the chances are there would absolutely be some similarities, but we wouldn't all agree on the number one most important thing. And that's because we are absolutely influenced by the biases that we have, our cultural background, our experience, our understanding of the data, our experience in the workforce. All of these personal biases and unique characteristics that make us beautifully human actually make the process of identifying insights more problematic than they could be if we all actually just thought in the same way and saw the same things. A really lovely example of that comes to mind is about 18 months ago, I was in the Northern Territory doing some work in Alice Springs, and I was lucky enough to go out to Uluru with one of my friends who works in Alice Springs. And we had a local First Nations ranger take us around Uluru, around this sacred space. And it was awesome because he got to tell us and share with us all of these wonderful stories and experiences that he had in the local area, and I guess and pass on his wisdom and his knowledge. The thing that really stood out to me, and the part of that story that really relates to this idea of an insight being a different perspective and different for different people, was he said to us, he said, when you look at the stars, what you think about is you might think about star signs, you might think about constellations of the stars. And in Australia, we have a constellation called the Southern Cross, and we often, to identify the Southern Cross, there are two pointers that we look at and they direct us to the Southern Cross. And he said, they're the things that you look for. But as somebody who is Indigenous to Australia, he said, the way I use the stars is I look at them, and what I get to see and know is I know when the emu's belly is full with eggs, and I know when the snapper are being pushed towards the shore, so we know when to fish. And it was just this beautiful reminder that when presented with literally the exact same data of the stars, our backgrounds and our culture completely influenced different insights and different messages to take from the same information. So trends are the things that we've come to expect. They're the repetition of a pattern that we were anticipating or we thought we were going to see. Whereas an insight is that light bulb moment, it's the aha moment, it's the thing that actually shifts our perspective. And as I've been talking, I'm sure you have been thinking about times where you've looked at data or you've been in a presentation and you've heard something and it's really stuck with you and it has been a real light bulb moment. Those things, whether it's quantitative data, whether it's qualitative data, whether you're listening to a podcast episode, if it sticks with you and it shifts your perspective, that's an insight. It's not a trend. But, so that rule applies almost all of the time. There is an instance or one chance where what I have just said is actually not true. And the trend, what might be a trend to an outsider, is actually an insight to you if you're an insider. So if you have been working on a particular metric, so say you have had some element of your business that has been plateauing over the last 6 months. And so the decision, because of the plateau, has been that you've invested a whole lot of time and effort and resources into fixing or adjusting or shifting this metric. Then when you see the data come out, if it's the same, to an outsider, they might look at that and think, oh, well, that's a trend, that's a pattern that's reoccurring. It might actually be a very similar result to the past, but if you know that you've been actively trying to improve that, to shift it, to make it better, and it hasn't changed, then you being the insider with that insider knowledge, that is actually going to be really insightful for you, and it is going to really be a result or show a value that you weren't expecting because you were expecting it to improve. So I just wanted to kind of share that little anecdote because because whether the data or the value changes is not as important as whether or not it is something that shifts your perspective. If it does, it's an insight. If it doesn't, if you were expecting it, it's a trend. Now, why is this so important to get right? Well, as I've shared with you in another episode, when I talk about data storytelling and I refer to the times when people are sitting with their own data or working with members of their team or with other people from their organization, they're trying to answer two questions. The first question is, what are the trends and the insights in the data that we can see? And the second question is then, well, what do we do about it now that we know? That first question, what are the trends and the insights in the data, is really important to get right, because if we don't identify the trends and insights correctly, if we miss something, then the decisions that we make and the actions that we take will be based on perhaps data that was less important than some of the other things that we could have potentially seen. So when we're doing our own digging and investigation into the data that we have, it's important as we're going through that process and thinking about it to ourselves, we're thinking, what are those trends? What are those patterns and the things that I've expected to see? And what are the things that are repeating over and over and over again, which are unsurprising to me? And it's important to look at that as objectively as possible and to note take and record all of those trends. It's then important to think about, okay, so what are the insights? And almost brainstorm all of the insights that you see in that data set or in that set of information. What are those things that really pique your curiosity, that differ from what you had expected and that shift your perspective? If you're working with other people, it's also really important that you have the confidence to ask those questions, that you're able to ask what the trends are that other people can see and what their insights are as well. And being able to use that language with teams. In a previous episode, we've talked about the importance of language and how important it is to get the vocab right so that our teams know what to expect and what good practice looks like. And so being able to prompt other people around the trends and the insights piece is really important, and it also shows that you're modeling best practice. So your little takeaway from this episode, and something for you to begin thinking about, is when you ask people to look at data, how are you capitalizing on multiple perspectives, different cultures, different backgrounds, different biases, different experiences? How are you tapping into all of that wisdom in your team to really ensure that the trends and the insights that you identify collectively are representative of everybody's perspective and they are actually right? Because I hate to say it, maybe I love to say it, but I hate to say it. Just because you identify something as a trend or an insight and feel that it's the highest priority, not everybody else is going to agree with you. And there's a very good chance that they're going to see other things. They will contribute different elements to the conversation and discussion. And actually, analysis and thinking about those two data storytelling questions happens best when we're sitting down, talking about the data, sharing ideas, talking about what we see, what we perceive to be an insight and a trend, and what really stands out in the data set for us. And when we can do that well, as I've said, it means that the actions that we take, the decisions that we make, are more accurate and more likely to hit the mark. So thanks for joining us for this episode of Make Data Talk. If you found this episode useful, I'd love for you to share this with some of your other nerdy data friends. And if you'd like to hear more and stay up to date with my work, you can jump onto my website, selenafisk.com, and sign up to my very irregular newsletter. Thanks for joining us. Talk to you next time.